Mr. Prime Minister, do you have a comment on the Conservatives continuing to dig down into the Aga Khan affair?
Listen, this matter was closed years ago. Conservatives seem to have trouble understanding that in a democratic country like Canada, neither opposition parties nor a government can direct the police to do or to not do whatever they want. We have a strong, independent process in Canada, and we trust that.
The U.S. has much to be weakened militarily. The reaction to the government saying that a big reason they invoked the Emergencies Act is the economic damage done by things like the border blockades during the convoy protests, and then Stats Canada data showing that really we aren't seeing that much impact on Canadian imports and exports in February.
Well, I think it's very interesting. I think it undermines a lot of the government's arguments in relation to the justification for imposing the Emergencies Act. Conservatives have never condoned blockades on critical infrastructure. And I think it's very interesting to look back at the PBO report in 2020 in relation to the railroad blockades, which was estimated to have cost our economy up to $300 million. I think that's very comparable to what Statistics Canada showed here. And we saw how the government reacted to that protest. They sent in negotiators. It lasted for months, and they reached a resolution. And yet, with this protest, they used the never-before-used Emergencies Act for a comparable economic consequence. So I think it's very interesting how the government has reacted very differently in these two cases.
And when pressing this more, Minister Mendicino was using things like the layoffs at auto plants in the Windsor area as justification, showing the real economic damage happening in real time. In your view, is that enough to use an economic argument for invoking the Emergencies Act?
Well, I don't think anyone's downplaying, the impact that the border blockades did have on things like the auto industry. But I think when we're talking about something as essential as Canadian civil liberties, we have to draw a distinction between what the border protests were and what the protests in Ottawa were. And the protests in Ottawa were not in any way impacting the auto sector or cross-border trade. And the government, we know, used the Emergency Act predominantly to deal with the Ottawa protests. So I view these as distinct issues.
What about the fact that the stated goal of some of the organizers of the Ottawa protests was to bring down the Canadian government? What do you think that was?
Well, I think, we're always going to find extreme groups on both sides of the spectrum when you're dealing with, intense situations like we've seen. But we have to look at, the broad spectrum of Canadians who were involved in the protests were predominantly concerned about issues related to COVID-19 mandates and their view that the government was, overreaching with these mandates. And so, obviously, that was the motivation for the vast majority of these protesters. And I don't really take the government seriously with their claims that there was a real threat to overthrow the government.
That's not what the organizers protested. You had Canada Unity out there. You had Tom Marazzo saying he was going to sit down and meet with the opposition parties and the Governor General in some kind of ruling junta. You had Canada Unity out there. One of the main organizing groups with a memo of understanding that they would take power from the elected government. You think that was a small fringe group of this?
Well, look, you're using terms like junta. I mean, Canadians, have a right to write to the Governor General. They have the right to write to their senators. I would call that a group of Canadians who have a very poor understanding of our civic, our civic system of government. And I think it just belies the fact that we need better education in our schools to show people how our system of government really actually works.
What about the weapons found in Alberta?
The weapons found in Alberta, it's a terrible situation. What we saw happen at Coots. I believe that it was not actually at the protest site, but I think we need to get more information on the government on what was the motivations of the people involved with these firearms. I do know that the protesters dismantled the blockades very quickly afterwards because they didn't want to be associated with any sort of potential terrorist activity, potential extremist activity. And we know that the RCMP was acting very professionally in infiltrating this group and dismantling and preventing anything from happening. And that was before the invocation of the Emergencies Act. So I don't really think that the invocation of the Emergencies Act based on what happened in Coots really justifies the use of the Act.
You don't see any difference between what happened here in Ottawa, what happened in Coots, what happened at Windsor, between what happened here and what happened down in Tyne with the railroad blockade down there? You see no difference?
No, I see a lot of difference between what happened at Coots and what happened in Ottawa. What happened at Coots and at the other border crossings was an attempt by people to blockade our borders, to send a political message, which I think is inappropriate. As Conservatives, we actually ran on a platform of protecting critical infrastructure in this country. But when we're talking about the protests in Ottawa, we're talking about people who wanted to come to the center of government in this country and send a message to government officials that they were not pleased with the COVID-19 mandates.
Are you going to support the Rolling Thunder protest this weekend?
No, it's not for me as a politician to, support one protest over another.
Your colleagues do, though. The interim leader of your party did.
Look, it's my job.
The guy who's leading the leadership race right now, he took you brought donuts and coffee.
Look, I'm not going to pass judgment on what other colleagues or members of Parliament do, but my job as a parliamentarian is to hold this government accountable for its use of the Emergencies Act for the first time in Canadian history, and that's what I'm intending to do. Thank you very much for the interview requests, and you guys have a great day.
Good afternoon, everybody. I missed you all. Have I told you how much I missed you? Today, Environment Commissioner DeMarco has released his latest report, this regarding the government's commitments on a just transition. And it's very disturbing because we see this continual pattern with the Liberal government of making huge promises on dealing with the climate crisis and then completely failing. As the Commissioner points out, this government has missed every single promise they've made on the environment. We continue to be the ultimate outlier in the G7, but I'm very concerned about the findings in this study, particularly as it relates to the just transition. He talks about a potential economic crisis as big as the collapse of the cod fishery. You'd think by now, with 7 years under their belt, the government would be ready for this, and they clearly aren't. We're running out of time. We are in the climate crisis. The government has to stop talking and promising and actually start delivering. There's so many other elements in this report on the promises they've made on hydrogen. They are not moving towards the targets fast enough, so we are urging the government to do the right thing. Ce matin, M. DeMarco a publié le nouvel rapport concernant le plan libéral pour de mettre en place une transition juste. Et c'est clair, le gouvernement continue d'échouer leur obligation de répondre à la crise climatique. Ce n'est pas acceptable. Pour les familles et les travailleurs dans le secteur énergie, c'est nécessaire pour le gouvernement de faire une promesse claire et de mettre en place l'investissement nécessaire pour assurer le développement d'une économie propre. Et maintenant, le gouvernement, M. Trudeau, c'est clair. Ce gouvernement est un open bar pour les lobbyistes de les grandes entreprises pétrolières, mais le potentiel pour le développement d'une économie durable et propre, c'est clair. Mais le gouvernement continue d'ignorer leurs obligations et le rapport de M. DeMarco demande une réponse claire de M. Guilbeault, parce que j'adore M. Guilbeault, mais en réalité, il est un désastre dans ce dossier-là.
Charlie, can you talk about remote Indigenous communities in your riding and how the carbon tax has affected their daily lives?
What we're seeing with the promise of the carbon tax, Mr. Trudeau continues to tell us, and Mr. Guilbeault continues to tell us that this is the most effective way of responding. And yet, big oil continues to get free breaks all the time. They are not paying what they're supposed to pay, but other people are, and that's not fair. In terms of the far north, in terms of Indigenous communities, we still see communities that are completely dependent on diesel, for example. They cannot afford the costs of heating their homes. So if we are going to move to a transition in the economy, we need to make sure that the polluter actually does pay and that the big companies that are making record profits pay their share. As for Northern Indigenous communities, there has to be a reasonable way of making sure that they can transition, they can get off the diesel, that we can have other forms of energy so that these communities can sustain themselves.
Mr. Angus,
Le fait que le commissaire dise que les données du gouvernement sur la réduction des GES par l'hydrogène ne sont pas fiables, est-ce que ça veut dire, selon vous, que le gouvernement a mal fait ses devoirs à d'autres niveaux?
Répétez la question.
Est-ce que le commissaire dit que les données du gouvernement sur la réduction des GES par l'hydrogène ne sont pas fiables? Est-ce que, selon vous, ça veut dire que le gouvernement a mal fait ses devoirs à d'autres niveaux?
Well, il y a beaucoup de questions dans ce dossier. Le rapport de M. DeMarco, c'est clair, le gouvernement a fait des promesses, mais ignoré la nécessité de mettre en place les réponses crédibles pour la réduction des gaz à effet de serre, pour la nécessité de mettre en place un plan pour une transition juste, et aussi pour assurer un système équitable de répondre à système pour le prix du charbon.
Les normes pour les grands émetteurs, semble-t-il, selon le commissaire, ne sont pas assez contraignantes. Est-ce que c'est juste de demander aux citoyens moyens de faire sa part à la pompe avec la tarification sur le carbone et que d'autre part, les grands émetteurs, eux, font face à des restrictions qui sont très peu contraignantes? Comment vous voyez ça et croyez-vous qu'il faut sévir contre les grands émetteurs?
Well, le problème, ce n'est pas possible pour le système de mettre en place un prix de charbon. Ce n'est pas possible pour cette plan d'avoir succès si le gouvernement refuse de mettre en place l'obligation pour les grandes entreprises pétrolières de payer leur juste part. Le gouvernement déclare, oh, c'est clair, le polluteur paye, mais en réalité, les grandes industries pétrolières reçoivent un cadeau du gouvernement. C'est nécessaire pour le gouvernement d'établir le prix et pour assurer que les grandes entreprises pétrolières vont payer leur juste part.
Mr. Angus, many Indigenous communities need to rely on diesel. You hear the government line saying, oh, families, they get their more than they pay for carbon tax back in their rebate. Is that the case for people in your community, in your riding?
The problem what we're dealing here is we see that the government has made promises on the carbon tax, but they have not really put in place a system that's credible here. We know that the big petroleum companies are not paying close to their share. If they were paying close to their share, then they would be reinvesting in alternatives, and they're not. They're making money hand over fist. They're making money like bandits, and we're just sitting back and saying, oh, great, gas prices are $2 at the pump in Northern Ontario, and these companies are making money in profits that are unprecedented. Meanwhile, in far northern communities where they're having to rely on diesel, it is very, very difficult for communities in the northern communities to pay their share. So what we would say to the government is we accept the price that polluter pays. The polluter should pay. But if we're going to change how we're doing carbon pricing, we need to put a frame of justice on this. And part of that frame of justice is saying we shouldn't be having communities rely on diesel. It is a retrograde system, but that's what northern communities are faced with.
And just shifting quickly to the Emergencies Act inquiry, we have new data from Stats Canada showing that overall import-export numbers didn't take that much of a hit from the border blockades that we saw back in February. Had you, with the benefit of hindsight, knowing this kind of economic impact, would that have changed your support for this on the economic argument the government made for using the Act?
Well, I would never see in a situation as a legislator and parliamentarian that I think, hey, it's perfectly okay if you want to come and shut our borders down because you don't like to wear a mask. That's ridiculous. The fact that this went on as long as it did is even more ridiculous. I think the issue of the Emergency Act, and we said this at the beginning, it needs to be fully investigated how all this went down, because what we saw at every step of the way was failures of leadership. We saw failures of leadership with the Ottawa Police. We saw failures of leadership in this community in protecting their people. To get to the level that the province finally stepped in and then the feds, that requires, I think, an inquiry, and we need answers, and we need the whole picture. And so I look forward to what we find.
Last question.
Can I just ask you then, on polluter pay, what more do you think the government needs to do to make sure that the big emitters, the big companies pay their share?
Well, if you look at there was a recent report from Environmental Defense on just how much of a scam the carbon tax has been for the big energy polluters. The amount that they're supposed to pay and the amount that they're actually paying, there's a huge, enormous difference. If they were paying what the government says they're paying, those companies would have a serious incentive to invest in the huge opportunities that are there in hydro, the huge opportunities in geothermal and wind. We're not talking about pie in the sky here. We're talking about a new energy economy that's waiting in Canada right now, but we're not seeing the investments. The whole principle of carbon pricing is supposed to be, as oil and gas become more expensive, they will reinvest in the new economy. They're not doing it because they're getting freebies here, so it's not working right now. So I think Mr. Trudeau needs to explain why he continues to give free gifts to big oil. Meanwhile, northern Indigenous communities, nobody's given them a gift. Thank you. Thank you.